video, I will discuss to you the continuation of the normative ethical theories. At the end of this discussion, students should be able to understand the natural moral law, learn the principle of natural moral law, and determine the strengths and weaknesses of the natural moral law ethics. Let's begin with the origin of natural moral law. The idea of natural moral law does not originate with Christianity. Natural moral law holds that there are rights and moral values that can be understood from human nature and which can be deduced by human reason. Which means the natural laws are universal and should be used to judge the laws of particular societies. Aristotle argued that the distinctive feature of human beings is their ability to reason. Humans can use the reason to discover the end or purpose of human life, which means having an understanding of this natural moral law, we can then work to achieve it in any way that fulfills our purpose. Acting in accordance with one's innate moral conscience is what makes a good act. This is because if it is aligned with our natural purpose, then it is aligned with God and God is good. The most distinctive version of natural moral law is that of Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas took up Aristotle's ideas about the end or goal of human life, being happy or having a complete well-being, and associated with the Christian view of that goal as being union with God in the next life, which means human beings have an essential rational nature given by God so that we can flourish. Next is the key features of Aquinas' natural moral law. Let's begin with the fourfold division of law, which is under this we have the eternal law, divine law, natural moral law, and human law, wherein eternal law comes from God's nature as the creator, and the universe and nature inevitably reflect the principles of the natural and moral order which existed before creation as a blueprint in the mind of God, which means humans must therefore live a life based on that order which is objective and absolute and applies to all, because since God's blueprint of humans means that we all share a common human nature, then what is right for one person must be right for everyone else, with no exceptions. So natural law designed by God so humans can achieve purpose, which is to reflect God's image and be in communion with the divine. Next is the divine law. So these are laws which can be found in special revelation such as the Bible and through the teachings of Jesus. So this divine law is somehow related to the eternal law. Next is the natural moral law. It is articulated in detail through human reason and not through revelation. Although the divine law, for example, the 10 Commandments forbids murder, theft, and adultery, that is only by way of a reminder from God, since we can know simply through reason that these things are wrong. So in other words, this refers to the moral law of God built into human nature. So Aquinas sees the natural moral law as that part of God's eternal law that human beings can understand simply through the application of reason. And lastly, we have the human law. These are laws which appear in our legal systems and should not contradict the natural moral law. So by understanding the natural moral law, we can now formulate human laws. Next key point is the main guiding principle is that good is to be done and pursued and evil is to be avoided. So Aquinas realized that God has instilled in us natural inclinations to behave in certain ways which lead us to the highest good. So this is the first order of the law, which is all rational people seek to achieve good and avoid evil. So this is called as the synderesis principle. This is because we are designed for the purpose of doing good, so we would not knowingly pursue evil. Aquinas also acknowledged that sometimes we do in fact commit sin. He called this apparent good, so it is when we do something we think is good, but in reality does not fit into the God's plan for human. Example, if someone commits adultery, they may not do it to inflict harm, but because they think they are just in love. So in order for us to differentiate between real and apparent good, we need to use our reason correctly. Another key point is this main guiding principle brings us to the primary precepts or principles. So in man, there is first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances, which means the actions of man are dependent or related to the influences of the nature in which he belongs or were used to be. Second, there is in man an inclination to things that pertain to him more specially according to that nature which he has in common with other animals. Example, what are the principles or things that are common to man and animal? So we have the reproduction or the giving birth to an offspring. Third, there is in man an inclination to good according to the nature of his reason, which nature is proper to him. Thus, man has a natural inclination to know the truth about God and to live in society. So these primary precepts are internally true and universal, which applies to everyone without exception. So the primary precepts are abbreviated as POWER, where P stands for preservation of innocent life, O for ordered society, W for worship God, E for education, and R for reproduction. Next is the primary precepts as teleological rules. So they are concerned with our final end, which has 3 points of focus. First, our telos, or the goal, purpose, or end on earth is happiness, which can lead to human flourishing, which means the primary precepts, which are abbreviated as POWER, is relatable to one another. Example, living in an ordered society provide a stable basis for the education of children, in preserving life, for developing good relationship, and for the procreation of children. Next, the telos of humanity as a whole also has an ultimate focus. Complete happiness cannot be found in something created, but only in the beatific vision of God that is promised in the next life, which means full happiness does not reside in wealth or glory or honors, or in knowledge of virtue, or in any created reality, but in the loving vision of God. Therefore, God alone constitutes man's happiness. And lastly, the telos for humans after death has an individual as well as a collective focus, which means the telos for humanity as a whole is the vision of God, which is the union with Him. Next is, from the primary precepts, we derive secondary precepts. So final ends are about the intentions, which means whatever promotes the final end is right and whatever goes against it is wrong. Therefore, if the final end of sex is reproduction, any act of sex that does not lead directly to the possibility of procreation is wrong, or any such act that violates the nature and purpose of sexual intercourse. So we can best explain this in the following illustration. So as you can see here, we have the primary precepts in the left, which is the power or the preservation of innocent life, reproduction, education of children, worship God, and living in an ordered society. And on the right, we have here the secondary precepts. So first here is masturbation. Therefore, masturbation is wrong because it stops the final end, which is the reproduction. So one cannot reproduce through masturbation. Another one is the bestiality, or it is where humans engage in sexual relations with animals. Therefore, it is morally wrong because bestiality cannot lead to reproduction. Then using coitus interruptus to avoid conception. So what is coitus interruptus? It is the practice of withdrawing the penis from the vagina and away from a woman's external genitals before ejaculation to prevent pregnancy. Therefore, it is wrong because it stops reproduction. Another one is contraception. We all know that it is morally wrong because it stops reproduction. We also have here abortion. So it is wrong because it stops reproduction and it kills the fetus, so it does not preserve innocent life. We also have the homosexual sex, so it is wrong also because it cannot lead to reproduction. Adultery is also wrong because it is injustice. Consensual sex outside marriage is also wrong because when you say consensual sex outside marriage, it may be applied to situation of a single person having sex with a married person. But from a religious perspective, it could refer to sex between people who are not in conjugal relationship. Therefore, it is morally wrong because it goes against the welfare of any children who are born from the liaison, and it is also morally wrong because children born from the liaison may lack a permanent father and may not be properly educated. And lastly, polygamy. It is not against the natural law since the man may be able to give sufficient attention to bring about reproduction with each wife. But it is against the divine law in which marriage illustrates Christ's relationship with the church. Another one, how do we avoid making mistakes? So we should avoid becoming confused about the difference between real and apparent goods. Example, adultery. So adultery can feel like a real good because of its short-term pleasures. But when we consider what adultery involves, betrayal, injustice, lies, putting children at risk, it is clearly not good at all. We should also be aware of the difference between interior and exterior acts. Example, giving money to charity in order to be admired. So someone who gives money to charity in order to be admired by others gets no further than performing a good exterior act, and that is not true morality. However, the process of following the real good can be aided by following the virtues. Example, to be a good person is to have a good character. That is why we need to practice the following virtues. So we have the cardinal virtues. First is the prudence, wherein prudence is the practical wisdom or the ability to understand a situation and to use practical reason to work out what to do. Second, justice. It is the moderation between selfishness and selflessness. Next, fortitude or courage. It is the virtue that moderates the emotions of fear and daring in accordance with right reason. Example, sitting in a bathtub full of deadly snake or jumping from the rooftop of one building to another are acts of daring but not acts of fortitude. Lastly, we have temperance, also known as restraint, or the practice of self-control, abstention, and habitual moderation in the indulgence of natural appetite or passion. Example, you refrain from drinking any alcoholic drink. Aside from cardinal virtues, we also have the theological virtues. First is faith, refers to the belief in God and belief in what is revealed through the scripture and the church. Hope means the hope of heaven and beatific vision. And love, which basically means love of God above all things and love of one's neighbor through love of God. As we all know, love binds everything together in perfect harmony. Let's now proceed with the strength of natural moral law ethics. First, Natural moral law enables people to establish common rules by which people can live in an ordered society. Natural moral law sets firm boundaries for moral behavior. Another strength, morality is about what is intrinsically good or bad. Aquinas' system is realistic in that it acknowledges that people can make mistakes, for example, by being confused about the difference between real and apparent goods. Natural moral law has been a basis for developing our ideas about natural rights. Aquinas' natural moral law is in line with Aristotelian virtue ethics in that it focuses on the development of good moral character through practicing the cardinal virtues of justice, prudence, temperance or the self-control, and fortitude, along with the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. And lastly, natural moral law is very adaptable. Let's proceed with the weaknesses of natural moral law ethics. First, one of the greatest weaknesses of natural moral law is its teleological view that we all share a common human nature designed by God. So this leads in a particular to some very questionable claims about human sexual nature, specifically that God's plan requires human sexuality to be geared specifically to procreation. So the list of secondary precepts which derive from this approach includes the condemnation of masturbation, same-sex relationship, and artificial contraception. So the prohibition of artificial means of contraception alone has arguably led to untold misery for millions. It has also led to the persecution of homosexuals and to the repression of natural sexual instincts. Next weakness, although some forms of natural moral law can be atheistic, that of Aquinas cannot, which means Aquinas assumed that it was natural for all humans to worship God, but that is not a natural assumption for an atheist. And lastly, it seems clear that natural moral law can lead to immoral outcomes, which means, for example, despite the fact that the Catholic Church is easily the largest provider of care for HIV/AIDS patients, its prohibition of artificial methods of contraception has contributed to the spread of AIDS. So that would be all for this discussion. I hope that you learned something, and this is my references for my PowerPoint. Thank you and see you on my next video.